The next example that we're examining is Wholehouse. So the progressives, it was a massive movement. It was men and women, and they were all looking at different issues. And even within the group of women, they're looking at different issues too. You watch the movie that focuses on suffrage, but sometimes many of them wore many hats, so they kind of cross-listed each other. But another important movement, again, looking at that argument of looking at the concept of home and bridging that concept to the community, which allows women to enter public space, is the example of Wholehouse. Wholehouse is a very famous institution in American history. It was created by Jane Addams, who you saw in the intro of this PowerPoint. And I think she got some kind of Nobel Prize for it, where she saw a problem, a lot of immigrants entering the United States, and she wanted to do some good, which was to Americanize many of these immigrants. So she established a place called Wholehouse in Chicago and tried to help them become American citizens, if not at the very least be able to navigate through the United States. So she created this organization, and there are many of these throughout the United States, and a lot of them were affiliated with religious organizations too. So Wholehouse, you have a group of educated women. As I mentioned earlier, the whole concept of social work is being developed at these type of places, which eventually is kind of supported by the local university, because it's almost like an anthropological study, right? That they're studying these communities to see how they can better serve them. So they established a school in Chicago, and they were trying to assimilate many of these immigrants, which probably some of your relatives came during this wave of immigration, right? The Greeks, the Italians, the Germans, and so forth. Maybe some of you can trace your family tree to some of these waves of immigrants that were coming at this turn of the century. As I noted earlier, a lot of American corporations were traveling to Europe, Italy, and so forth, and telling immigrants that there were plenty of jobs in the United States, so they can come and flood the market and then lower the wages of workers just in general. So now that these immigrants are here, what are you going to do with them, right? So this organization was established to address that particular issue. So Wholehouse has been presented as this kind of Americanization model. And when it first started, it was very problematic because, I mean, here you have the task of Americanizing immigrants. Where do you begin, right? What does it even mean to be American? So that's something that you might struggle with if I were to ask you that. I typically do in class, to define what is American. And I'm not talking about the flag and all that kind of stuff, right? But what makes us part of this kind of collective culture? So they established two models. The first one that they established, this is early on when they first started, was called the Anglo-Saxon model, basically trying to make them into American citizens, right? Following our political traditions, our language, things like that. So this would be an example of the assimilation model. Get rid of your old culture and take up this new culture. Which is very difficult to do, right? I mean, if you were to move to France and overnight they tell you, get rid of your American culture and be French, how are you going to do that? That's kind of hard to do right away, correct? So, but that's what they tried. The second model was one that's called, and one that we are more familiar with, the cosmopolitan model, which is more of a melting pot theory, where yes, there's some traditions that make us American, but then other groups come in and add to that idea of what America means. And we see it in different ways, such as in maybe language, right? Sometimes food, things like that. So what happens? Well, Wholehouse tried to assimilate many of these people. They try to integrate them. And what we find is that they were a complete failure. They actually didn't have a very large membership. It is noted that only about 3% of the Chicago immigrant community attended Wholehouse. 3%, that's nothing. You have to understand that in the context of even modern politics about immigration, a lot of times we say, well, my ancestors came back in 1900s with these people and they became American citizens. That's nonsense. We find that, today immigrants tend to maintain their culture. Back then, immigrants maintain their culture too. Again, 3% doesn't have much of a major impact, right? Most of the people that they targeted tend to be women because men didn't want to participate. So if you were married, maybe your wife would go to some of these classes to try to assimilate into American culture, but for the most part, even women, were very selective as to what classes they took. A lot of times it was cooking, and you have to understand that these courses and Wholehouse were quite condescending to the immigrants because they saw their practices as wrong, and they saw what they were trying to teach them as the right way. So many immigrants didn't want to participate in some of these courses that they held. So in the end, they actually completely failed. They even though she got the Nobel Prize, they completely failed having much influence in the local community. Many of them don't assimilate. Many of them don't want to be American. Many of them maintain their culture. The Greeks remain Greeks. The Italians remain Italian. And it's really until the second generation, until they have kids, where those kids want to be part of this concept of the United States, right? More American. And that still holds true today. So as they're trying to assimilate many of these immigrants in places like Chicago and New York and El Paso and Los Angeles and even San Francisco, it's all over the United States, many immigrants have their own institutions. We see that today. I mean, when you talk about many immigrant communities, they have their own stores, right? Carnicerias for Mexicans, right? Italian markets for Italians. They have their own restaurants. They have their own organizations that help them maintain their ethnic identity that's tied back to their home country. So many of them don't want to be American. So they only got those that wanted to be American. So what we find is that the majority of them did not actually assimilate. So when you hear that kind of racist rhetoric of, well, my parents or grandparents came here, great-grandparents came here, they became American, nothing's further from the truth. The majority did not. And this is part of that American folklore, sorry, that's created much, much later. So what happens to these type of programs? Well, as I stated, the first program was the Anglo-Saxon, but essentially that system kind of failed. So Wholehouse implements this other idea called cultural pluralism. And cultural pluralism promotes the idea that immigrants can contribute to this idea that we call America. In other words, they create the melting pot theory. And a lot of it had to do maybe through frustration that they just, immigrants didn't want to assimilate. So, how can we bring them in but not offend them, right? So we take elements of their culture and we make it fit into this idea of America. So these progressives have good ideas, right? And their ideals are good. Maybe their intentions are good too, but in the end, they kind of fail at their objectives. So what do we learn? Number one, even though they fail in places like Wholehouse, and even though they're kicked out of the the kind of child care issue in the previous lecture, we find that these type of programs allow women to enter public space, and that's quite critical because only a couple of decades ago, if you enter public space alone, you could have been seen as a prostitute. Now they're able to enter it without much problem, but also have job opportunities there too. They create these programs. Again, very classist, very racist, and because they create them in a very kind of middle class lens. They're trying to help these immigrant people, or they're trying to help these poor people to be like them, but they don't have the money, right? Immigrants don't have the resources to live the life that they're living. So it's a very kind of classist perspective on trying to assimilate or help poor people, which is again very problematic in many ways. But they did help some people, as I noted. Some 3%. It's still 3%, right? It's some people that did want to seek help, and in places like in Chicago and El Paso, They established hospitals for many of these people who could not afford hospitals, right, or healthcare. So they provided affordable healthcare for many of these people. They provided teaching skills, work skills that they probably would have never had it not gone to some of these places. So, even though they helped a few people, those that they did help, some of them definitely benefited from it. And the last point here is that, is that women, particularly these white middle class progressive women, did feel a form of agency, that they had value in this new society now, that they were welcome to address political issues and help society to make it a better place. Remember that they take issues that men these problems that men created, and they try to create some good. So definitely kind of showcases women's agency, because people like Jane Addams, they took it upon themselves to do something good, to address the problem that industry, and obviously these are controlled by men, industry created during this period. So we do see that idea of agency at play here. All right, so we'll stop it, Eric.